Hello and welcome. This launches the book Business Storytelling from Hype to Hack. It's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Pippa Rann Books. And may I encourage you to subscribe to the YouTube channel and, if you like, to create a watch party for the program for yourself and your friends. But because this book is by my youngest son, Jyoti Guptara, I will not be chairing this program myself. In order to have a more objective discussion of the book, I have kindly requested, and Dr. Maureen Edmondson has kindly accepted the invitation to be chairman for today. Maureen is a retired Martian. Yes, you heard right. She used to work for Mars Incorporated for 20 years. Before which she was an academic for 4 years. And so she's been in the private sector for 20 years. And for another 20 years, she has had governance roles in what the British call the third sector. That is the charitable, the quasi-government sector, etc. So 20 years in governance, 20 years in the private sector, and 4 years in academia is not a bad record, is it? And I should say before we start that Maureen is coming in from her home, which is in a remote part of Ireland. And so there may be technical problems for which I apologize in advance. And if there's a real problem and she is knocked out of the program for technical reasons, then I will try in my poor way to step in. But may I invite you, Maureen, please to take over as chair now. Thank you very much indeed, Maureen.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Guptara Prabhu, for the invitation to chair this.
That's better. Start again. No? No? No, 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 no. No, no, no. You're muted. That's better.
Okay, it's now telling me I am on mute, actually, but that's fine. So thank you so much for asking me to do this. It's a real privilege.
I think we have a problem because we can't hear Maureen at all. You can hear her. Okay, okay. Carry on, Maureen.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you very much for allowing me to do this. It's a real privilege. And I am delighted to be with this auspicious panel. I'm a food scientist by training. I work for the Mars Corporation. And of course, as a scientist, I'm not really renowned as a storyteller. I've always been looking for facts and evidence. But actually, as I thought about this, any hypothesis is, in effect, a story. Creating an opportunity, and then you test it. So, in fact, maybe stories have been part of my life more than I realized. And of course, working for Mars Incorporated, family-owned, long-standing business, we were saturated in stories, which in effect, out of these stories grew the 5 principles of the corporation, which gave us as individuals enormous freedom of action and independent action, which nevertheless pulled us all in the one direction. So as I've reflected on that, and reflected on, of course, on the fact that in whatever culture we're in, or whatever faith background we have actually been given big stories. We weren't given a Google by our faith perspectives. We were given big stories that we could saturate ourselves in and marinate ourselves in so that we actually learnt the principles and the practices, and then out of that grew our individual practices and beliefs. So stories have been more of my life than I had actually realised, and I want to thank Jyoti for making me think more about that. And as we go forward tonight, I'll introduce the panel. I'll introduce Jyoti, excuse me, and then we will ask some questions and take your questions, and maybe not get them all, but we'll do as many as we possibly can. Robert Hall is from Dallas, Texas, and he describes himself as a recovering chief executive who's developed and led a very successful organization, Action Systems, excuse me, which was founded on training and then developed into a major customer relations management systems and organization. He is passionate about relationships and their interaction, how leaders interact with their organization, with their teams, and their relationships in that. Robert is author of several books, but most recently, The Land of Strangers. And this outlines the relationship crisis that's devastating with our societies and communities. And it's been described by Robert Boyes-Atzis of Harvard as the most important book of the decade. So really important for everybody in leadership. The Land of Strangers. Since leaving corporate life, Robert has been working with men and mentoring those who find themselves homeless. And his analysis is that, in fact, they become homeless not because they've lost their last dollar, but because they've lost their last relationship. So we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Robert, about stories and relationships. Our next panelist is Anastasia Kalinina. She is Russian-born, a true polyglot, fluent in Russian, Polish, French, and English. And she's authored one novel, one book of short stories, and some poetry. So we've got several authors on our panel tonight. She's lived in several countries and just recently has become co-founder of the Restate Foundation. It's a Swiss not-for-profit looking at new governance models. And that will be really exciting to see what comes out of that. Prior to this, Anastasia worked for 8 years with the World Economic Forum, where she had the wonderful title of being head of Eurasia. I think what a wonderful title that really is. Anastasia's studies and qualifications from a range of prestigious universities, all been in communication and using words creatively. So she's worked with Doctors of Children, charity that was trying to prevent violence towards women in Russia. And Anastasia and Jyoti were both participants in Polymar 5 Aspiring Young Professionals program in Berlin. It was hosted by Deutsche Bank, and they found themselves the 2 authors amongst a group of 30. So that brings me to Jyoti. And Jyoti dropped out of school at age 15. I think his parents were obviously really careless in letting him do that, but it's worked out incredibly well. And he pursued his passion as a storyteller and an author. His first co-author was his twin brother, Suresh, and together they published a fantasy trilogy, The Conspiracy of Calaspia, and has sold more than 100,000 copies and is in 3 different languages. So we certainly have an auspicious panel tonight, and we're looking forward to hearing their views about Jyoti's new book. Now, Jyoti, I have a first question for you, if I may. Business storytelling is a long way away from a fantasy novel, or even your short stories. So what has prompted you to write this work of non-fiction for business leaders?
Yeah, well, I want to start by thanking you, Maureen, for chairing today, and for Robert and Anastasia for joining, and to my father for publishing this book. As you said, having written 3 books with my twin brother, it made sense to publish the next book also in the family. So as a fantasy novelist, I was already involved with giving speeches at very serious and eminent places like Kofi Annan's Global Humanitarian Forum and the UN, and in different business groups. So I was always interested in how can we have a different angle on what people are doing in the real world. As Shakespeare said, literature is all about holding, as it were, the mirror to nature. And that's what stories do so well. But when it was 2015, I was invited by the Geneva Center for Security Policy to be their novelist in residence for 6 months. And it was a fabulous place, very interdisciplinary. And we had CEOs on sabbatical and generals from different countries. And then there was me, this novelist. And it was very inspiring. I got all sorts of ideas for stories. But I also noticed that a lot of people had fabulous experience, but they were actually at their best when they were telling stories, not from the stage, but during their coffee breaks. And so we developed an executive education course at the GCSP, which was Story as Influence. And we were helping diplomats to be even better at what they do by using stories. And that's where this all began. I started coaching, and after a dozen coaching sessions, I realized I had to start compiling documents because there was too much information to give people, and I had to develop frameworks and so on. So I started compiling all this information for myself and as cheat sheets for my clients. And before long, I realized there was enough material that could be developed into a book, and it would save my clients dozens of hours if they just read my book instead of paying me to give them all this information.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that explanation. And I'm sure we'll come back to you with some more questions, Jyoti, before long. But I'm going to ask Anastasia to unmute herself, and she's an author in her own right. So I want to ask you, Anastasia, what do you think about this book as a piece of writing, but also as a story, as an encouragement to tell stories and to use stories in a more effective way?
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me. Congratulations on the new upcoming book, Jyoti, and Prabhu for publishing it. Definitely, like you have suggested, Maureen, I've known Jyoti for a while now. It's been over 10 years since we both participated in what turned out to be quite a life-changing experience for both of us and another 26 young people who gathered in Berlin at that time. And I've got to know Jyoti quite deeply, just like other participants at that time. And of course, I've always known him primarily as a fiction author. And this is how we connected, and we got much to share. We had a project running back then that was called King's Authors Table, which was a youth award that we were planning together. So, of course, I've known Jyoti for his fantasy worlds that he's been creating with his twin brother. So it was quite a good news and a different kind of news when I heard that he's now publishing a nonfiction. And I got to read it with great pleasure. And as an avid reader of many business books, because of what I do and did in the past, I have, of course, many references. But then I think it's a very unique book because it really cuts to the core and gives you some very pragmatic advice on using storytelling in business, in nonprofit communications. I think it could be applied pretty much in every sphere of human activity, and that's what I find the most compelling. It got me giggle at times, it made me sad a couple of times, and I think the vulnerable moments that Jyoti was also quite brave to share were quite remarkable. So I love the book. I don't want to bring up any spoilers for the benefit of those who are still going to read it in the future, but I liked it very much.
Thank you, Anastasia. And Robert, can I ask you the same question, actually? What do you think about the book? You're also an author. What do you think is the value of this book?
Well, I really like the book a lot because I think it is really needed, and I think it does a great job of fulfilling a need. And I look at it primarily through kind of two different prisms. The first one is around leadership, and as a CEO for over 20 years, I now work with about 8 or 9 CEOs around the country in both public companies as well as private companies and nonprofits. What I find so often is organizations are struggling with what they might call mission or vision or even strategy. And one of the things that Jyoti covers right up front is that often companies are struggling because they have a strategy, but they have no story. That is, they have a pronounced direction, but meaning does not come from facts, does not come from pronouncements. Meaning comes from shared kind of emotion around shared experiences, shared values, and so forth. And so, first of all, in my experience, I would say I would recommend this book to every leader that I'm working with to say, for a number of you, this may be the missing piece in your leadership because you're smart, you have a strong work ethic, you believe in what you're doing, but often you do not have a story that reflects where the organization is going. And I would say specifically, do you have a story for the various stakeholders? Is there a story for the people who work in the organization, employees and workers? Is there a story for the marketplace, that is, for your customers or maybe different groups or segments of customers? And even if you're a public company, what's the story for those people who are investing in you? So to me, every CEO I know has varying capability here, but I don't know of any that couldn't really improve by saying storytelling and having a strong positive narrative is really a key part of your job. And if you don't have that piece in place, it will show up with lack of commitment, confusion, at times resistance. So I think that's my first point. My second point is I've written a lot on relationships. I think relationships are the single most valuable and value creating resource we have. And we live in a world today that is drowning in information, but very short on stories. We've become so adept at bypassing human interaction that we don't have the level of depth we used to have, both in sharing our story and hearing the stories of those with whom we interact. And so to me, again, if you want a world that has stronger, more productive relationships, then being more intentional about stories you share, stories you seek, stories you share, to me is really very important. So I think it's a big need. And Jyoti really has an inspiring way in the book of saying why this is important. And I think a lot of people on the surface agree that it's important. When they read this book, they'll have much more tangible and I believe committed view of why they need to be very intentional around stories.
Thank you, Robert. I'm going to come back to you and Anastasia, both with the question. Anastasia first. In your work experience, where have you found a story that was actually able to create a new vision or put a team together? And Robert, just to give you warning on the question I'm coming to you with, I suspect, given the work you're doing, you have had to deal with some dysfunctional teams and relationships. Where have you found story that actually helped heal that and move that all together in a better direction? But Anastasia first, where have you used story as an example to bring forward a new vision, a new strategy?
Sure. So definitely there was a single story in my life that has really changed it. And I believe it to have changed a lot of lives around the world. And this was the early days of what is called the Global Shapers community, of which I was a founding member. And the idea was that at the World Economic Forum, that many of you, of course, would know, people would come together, being prominent leaders in their respective industries and fields. We have gathered presidents and CEOs and heads of civil society organizations and head of movements, but there was very little concerning quite a huge number of people around the world, and that is the young population. So the youth was clearly underrepresented, not just during these gatherings, but overall in the world at tables where decisions were being made. And this is given that over 50% of the population is now under 27, this was quite unacceptable, and the world has come to realize that everything is shifting towards the youth. This was the time when Arab Spring happened, where more and more people were showing their tension with the current system, their being neglected in how decisions are being made. And so clearly there was a moment that youth as such came together and said, we have to be at the table where decisions are being made. We have the right to participate in everything that is concerning us. And we're the ones who will be shaping the world and inheriting the world that is currently being held in somebody else's hands. And so this is when we started the Global Shapers community that was set to unite this huge movement appearing all across the world. And after several years, we had over 300 hubs, city-based hubs of young people working together to create a change in their local communities. And among those people, we had young mayors, we had people living in the slums, we had people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, all of whom had a unifying vision of making youth a center of policy reforms, of decision-making, of policy-making. And it was, and it still is, quite a powerful project in that respect, because young people started sitting at the same table with those presidents that I mentioned and influenced directly how the decisions were made. So the beauty of that story is, of course, still showing. And I must say, in all of my experience at the World Economic Forum, it was really not just appealing to the rationale and presenting, diagrams and measures and facts, but really appealing to the heart of your counterpart and appealing to their emotions primarily, which quite often is driven by the young people still. Just remembering the last gatherings of the World Economic Forum, when it was still possible, there is one of the most favorite leaders of mine, Jen Godball, who is a famous animal rights campaigner, and she would always appeal through stories to people's minds. She had to sit down in front of many presidents and CEOs, and it's through her decision, to her storytelling abilities, that those messages were coming across quite powerfully. So I've been experiencing it all through my career that the stories are actually way more appealing when it comes to winning hearts and minds than potentially any other ways of communicating information. You're still muted, Maureen, I guess. Now better.
Sorry, thanks very much, Anastasia. Robert, how did stories from your experience help to resolve difficulties in dysfunctional teams?
I think,
can you give us an example?
Yeah, the best example I have, for over 10 years, my wife ran an inner city homeless ministry here in Dallas. And we had about 250 people volunteered who would work with individual families who were experiencing homelessness and so forth. And one of the challenges was that a number of those who had become homeless, some of those had made decisions that those who had not been in their shoes could be critical of. So we kind of had this group of homeless folks, and then we had professionals and executives and all of these, mostly white, from other neighborhoods coming in to help. And what we found was that the single most important thing we could ask when they were to sit down, so we'd be in teams of two, meeting often with a household, either a single parent or double parent household. And we found the best way to break the barrier is simply to start out by saying, tell me your story. And what we found is, as someone would share what had happened in their life, and it went from the data or the actual consequence to them actually sharing the story of what happened and how, that the barriers of judgment and being critical of them greatly diminished. So that was the first learning. And as valuable as that was, we had a second thing that we learned, and that is, not at the first interaction, but eventually there needed to be a time then where those of us who were trying to help them needed to share in a vulnerable way a story about something that we have or are struggling with. And what we found is that when both parties could share something real and vulnerable, that a lot of the barriers went away. And of course, what we found is that often those who were there to quote, to help, actually were greatly helped by the story. I'll give just one final example. One of the ladies I was paired with, I'd not met her before, was an attorney. And I noticed she always had a scarf. Well, it turns out she had brain cancer and had a very serious brain cancer condition going forward. And so when I talked to her a little bit about her story of why she was volunteering, she said one of her best friends said, you know, the only way you're going to get through this brain condition that may or may not take your life, but it may take your profession, is if you go help and serve someone else. That will help you more than anything else. And so the takeaway was that often the helpers are in great need of help, and the story, sharing the stories, is one of the ways people get on a common wavelength about our own humanity, regardless of what level we think we're at, or what level we think we came from. So the story, the word that Jyoti used in there, the hack, is that it touches us in ways known and in ways emotional that we cannot consciously describe, but it changes what's happening on the inside, and it then changes the behavior.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Robert. Jyoti, you give an example in the book of meeting the lady in the UN who was frustrated by UN speak and all of the stuff that went with that and all the organizations. And you convinced her, I think, over a conversation that storytelling might actually be really helpful. And she bounced off enthusiastically, as summarizing your text, to try it out. Did it work?
I think it always does, Maureen. I followed up with her recently, and she did say that people listen to you in a whole different way when you're talking about a story, because you're sharing as a human being and not as some kind of a cog in this system. So what jargon does is it puts a barrier between the person who's talking and the subject, but especially between the other person who's listening. So storytelling helps people to receive, believe, and remember your message. And that first part, receiving, is where I think we were able to shift things there, because at the UN, you have a lot of duplication. And as you say, it's in the book. And there's a lot of turf wars, as it were, because of different NGOs within the countries and internationally. And so there's a lot of confusion as well. There's a lot of frustration and a lot of politics. And so apparently it was a beautiful moment when they were able to reconnect about why they're actually doing what they're doing. But unfortunately, I don't know exactly how far that's gone. I think stories often are like, they sort of work their way through the system. But in these sorts of environments, it's very difficult to change the culture.
I have a question from the audience for you, Jyoti. And I suspect a lot of people will resonate with this question from John Oakes. If you know you're a poor storyteller, how do you improve your grasp of that skill?
Great question. And that's actually why I wrote the book, John. I don't think I'm a great storyteller myself, because I like to write. When you write 600-page books, you can take your time, you can reflect, you can edit, and you can take years if you have to. And then you have the benefit of an editor. So when I started helping other people to tell stories, I was able to be vulnerable myself and say, look, I'm not the best at this. And this is what actually forced me to study the art in a different way than someone who came to this more naturally. Because It's like when you have a mother tongue and someone asks you, why is the grammar that particular way? You say, I don't know. I just grew up speaking it that way. And it often takes someone who learns language as a second language to explain the rule to you. And so I came at this both as a natural storyteller when it came to fantastical stories, but also as someone who had to sort of take a step back, change disciplines, and deconstruct what I had been doing all my life in novels and transporting that into the business realm. So the book is full of tips. One of them is to use conversation. So you don't have to wait until you have a pitch or a presentation, and you don't have to talk to yourself in the mirror, but we can do what we do every day anyway. And that's, we ask each other how we are. And instead of just saying, I'm fine, how are you? You can say, well, actually, I'm delighted because I would tell someone if they asked me right now, I'm really excited because I've just launched my new book and it actually hit the bestseller list on Amazon in a couple of different categories.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that, Jyoti. Now, Anastasia, can I ask you another question? If you had read this book before you joined the World Economic Forum, or before you went into now that you've read it before you go in your new role, would you do anything different as a result of reading this book? Is there anything that surprised you in it?
Yes, definitely. Yes, definitely. And I know that there is at least one key takeaway that I could practically use after having read it now. And that is a profound understanding of that we all have stories in us. This is quite a straightforward thing, but you wouldn't think that, oh, there's anything compelling. You know, we just go about our lives thinking, oh, this is perfectly normal what I do, you know, and then you never frame what you do as a story, whereas in fact everything is a story if you tell it right. And so to me, the biggest learning is to collect my stories, really, you know, making sure that something that has happened that left a bit of an impact on myself and could be shaped into a small story to tell, given that the situation is right for that. Collecting those stories is something that I definitely will consciously start doing, and I almost wish I understood it back then. I think naturally we all are inclined to be collecting these stories, but as a conscious effort, I think it's quite a nice thing to do.
Robert, do you have a story bank? Jyoti talks about the story bank. And I confess I don't have one. But do you have a story bank? And how did you, if you do, how did you set about creating it? Or how will you set about creating it?
Well, I do have a story bank, and unfortunately, until I'd read Jyoti's book, I didn't know to call it that. But it's something over time. That's one of my favorite, really tangible advantages that come from reading the book is the idea of the story bank, because I kind of over a period of time, and tell you just a story about that. We were in our company in the early stages of what's today called CRM, or customer relationship management. And we had this idea of how to use information and build relationships. And so, but it was kind of an idea that was difficult to tell. And I was doing a lot of speaking and so forth. And somewhat accidentally, in one of my presentations to a large group, I shared something that happened to me. And unfortunately, it's a story. It'll take more time than I cover here. But the net of it was a young lady at a department store called Neiman Marcus who bailed me out on Christmas Eve in finding my wife a Christmas present, and how over the next year I wound up buying 4 more things from her and never went to the store. And there was a way that she took care of me in a very short period of time and gained enough information and built enough of a relationship to make that happen. So I told that story, and I wound up over the next year or two telling that story over and again as I spoke at a lot of conferences. Here's what's interesting. We had this complicated model of how to build relationships and what people needed to do. But a number of our clients would have me come in and speak to 1,000 or a couple thousand people. And the thing they most wanted was me to tell this simple, true story because it cut through all the complexity, it cut through all of the nuance, and just got the sense of meaning of why we're doing this and the fact that the clients were served by it, and clearly organizations who did that with their clients were served by it. And so what struck me out of that is I find that often we really don't understand the power of our stories, even the first couple or three times we tell it. But after we tell it, you know, the old saying, you don't know what you said till you hear back. And as you hear back from people, you understand how elements of that story touch them. There's a second thing that was really important is the reason clients had me come in and share these at large internal conferences is the story became a shared model for their people on what it was they were to be doing with their clients by being more proactive, by asking them more information, asking their clients that, and serving it forward. So I would look back and say over that 3-year period of time that really launched us as a company, we'd been around a while, but when we got in that area, really launched us, that we really, the story became the central driver of what it is we were about. Had we not had the story, we'd have still been doing the same things. But the story hacked the audience and hacked ourselves in terms of a vision, a meaningful vision around what we were doing. So coming out of that, I said, you know what? That's really powerful. And I started keeping track of, just as Anastasia has said, of things that touch me that I knew about. And then I began to think about stories, as I mentioned earlier. Oh, that's a story that our clients would value. Oh, this is a story that we need to share with employees because that stakeholder group would really respond to that. Or sometimes we other groups. So you begin to think about stories and which of your stakeholder groups, if you're in a leadership role, would that story resonate for? So keeping a bank of those and being able then to go back and as you think about an audience or an opportunity or a problem, how that story might tie in is worth the book itself, just that one idea.
Thank you, Robert. I have a question that's come in, which I think Anastasia and Jyoti might have a slightly different view from Robert. It's from Reverend Rad in the US, and it says, congratulations for the excellent book. But do you see generational differences among your clients when it comes to the stories that are appealing? And do emotions now carry more weight than facts? Anastasia, can I come to you first on that one? And we'll accept the fact that Robert's probably a different generation. He may have a slightly different view. There may be cultural views as well, of course.
It's an interesting one. I think overall, we might benefit from actually building a bit more on facts as humanity. I think we really are having a bit of problems with that. And I wish we relied more on facts than just manifestos and opinions and all. But the fact could also be a story. I don't think it is a matter of choosing between a story and a fact. A story is just a package for a fact, right? And a vision potentially. I'm actually quite keen to see how young people, at least, are very interested in stories that concern their future. And actually, I think any generation would react similarly to this one. I remember that, I think it was 4 years ago, the Forum has published an article that was called Welcome to 2030, I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better. The viewership of that was in the millions because it spoke about how in 2030 there will be very little private ownership, how the congestion, the traffic will go down, people will not be owning assets but sharing assets. And it was painted just so vividly. It was so easy to imagine yourself in that situation. And so we got an enormous response to that story. It wasn't real, right? It wasn't something that has happened before in our lives or anybody else's. But as a story that you can connect with, we especially got many responses from the young people. But overall, I think if it's a good one, if it really, if it really goes deep and touches your feelings and emotions, generational aspect is not so obvious. Maybe, the newer generation likes their information a bit more concise, as information bites, as shorter stories. But I think it is shared by all the different generations. I don't know, Jyoti, what kind of opinion you have on that? Be interesting.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that the whole point about stories is that they are universally applicable, that they resonate with everybody, no matter their age. So if we think of young children, they start off loving stories as soon as they can understand language, and even before. And I think it's a matter of consciously we tend to maybe neglect storytelling. I don't know at what age, but maybe as teenagers and as young adults, because we want to be taken more seriously. And so maybe we stop telling stories, especially in business, because we think that's what you do when you're a child, and this is the real world. And so I have to use facts and so on. So I agree that we should build more on facts, but they shouldn't be at conflict. We should just tell more truthful stories, and we should include the facts in those stories. And I think as people age, they become more appreciative of stories again, because, well, let's face it, the older you get, the faster time seems to pass, which is where midlife crises come from and all sorts of other headaches. And so probably when people reach a certain age, and it's different for everyone, they realize that they can actually relive moments, and they can experience years within hours. Let's say, well, as a novelist, I do a lot of readings as well. And a lot of young people these days, they say, I don't have time to read, because of course they're too busy playing games or learning for exams and that kind of a thing. And so I tell them you can actually save time by reading a book, because you can read in 1 week a family saga, which covers 3 generations, and you can experience years of joy and pain and transformation in just a couple of hours.
Sorry. Do you think there's a generational difference? Have you a brief response on this one?
I think there is a generational difference, but I think there's a bigger difference that's important. One of the things that every audience I'm in front of, I think of 2 groups. There's left-brain people who need numbers, and there's right-brain people who need emotive kinds of things. And so one of the things, I did this in my book, This Land of Strangers, I do it in everything, is I begin every chapter, I begin everything with a story. But I follow the story then with research and facts and scientific information that I have. And the reason that I found that is that the left brain people, the CFOs of the world, and they occupy very important positions, often cannot hear the story unless there's science or facts that somehow back up the essence of the story. So to me, regardless of age, you address both the left brain and the right brain. And I love what Anastasia said. And to the extent that the story, whether it's backward looking or current, is applied to the future, then that makes it much more relevant for them.
Thank you very much, all of you, for answering that one. Jyoti, one of the things that is a risk, I think, is that people can use stories to manipulate, and the facts may not be truthful facts. They may be all sorts of, nonsense. How do you avoid the risk of going for the emotions and manipulating people with stories, particularly when there's a different power ratio amongst the group?
You have to decide why you're telling the story. Ultimately, it's a question of morality, isn't it? And there are people who will abuse any tool or technology you can give them. the way I see it, the people who are out to manipulate and influence for evil are already making use of stories and anything else at their disposal. So I think it's only fair to try and level the playing field by helping as many people as possible who hopefully have better motives to master storytelling.
Thank you. That's an interesting thing. Just to balance you're balancing the playing field rather more, actually. We have a question that's come in from Michael Duraraj, and in a sense, you might have answered this about the generational one, but just to get a perspective, is this in relation really to the cultural differences that there might be? Where he says that thank you for the interesting discussion on storytelling, and in Indian culture, lessons are frequently through stories, and he gives a few various philosophies that is true. Have you a view as to whether there are serious cultural differences in the use of stories? Obviously, the story has to be relevant culturally, but is there a difference in your experience? Have you worked across several cultures and can comment on that? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I would say that in the West, stories have, for the last few decades, and maybe longer, but I'm not that old, been neglected, certainly in business, but also when it comes to education and in the family. And I have many fond memories of sitting in India in all sorts of different environments and hearing stories, some of my favorite memories, actually. Or even my own parents, who I realized told me stories a lot more than what tends to be typical. So there's definitely a difference. Also, I think between oral cultures and cultures where people are more focused on the written word. I haven't looked into it as a scholar or read much, so I'd be interested to hear whether Robert or Anastasia have any more insights on that question.
Anastasia, you've lived in several different countries. Have you got a view about the cultural differences and receptivity towards stories or use of stories?
I think overall stories are accepted and loved everywhere, but there is, of course, nuance. And I think it has to do with whether the culture is more, let's say, you take longer to interact with people, you go deeper into your stories. I remember growing up watching quite a few Indian movies, and they were always very dramatic. So it's, and right now I'm connecting with my Indian friends, like all of the stories they tell to be a bit more dramatic in a good way. So I think maybe there's a nuance in just the culture of storytelling. But on that note, I also think that storytelling could be a good equalizer. And Jyoti is mentioning trust in his book, in the chapter that I really liked a lot. And I think, they say that currency of politics is power, currency of economics is wealth, and the currency of society is trust. So stories could also be essential in community building, in any discipline, as a glue for society, and maybe healing the painful divides by accepting our vulnerability as human beings as such. And maybe it could also help bridge the gap of us versus them, because it's an awareness of the other that you can turn the other into us. And I think to the extent we can communicate across cultures more, then the divide will be maybe soft, and because everybody could, connect with this, the us versus them could finally eventually stop.
Okay, I've got one final question I'm going to ask all three of you, and it's come in from Michael again, and I think his concern is that this is business storytelling, and we are, of course, in the middle of a really difficult economic situation because of the COVID lockdowns in various countries and the different degrees of those. What story would you now like to tell into the current economic situation to help us move forward? So who would like to go first? Jyoti, I see you looking reasonably enthusiastic there. So we'll go from Jyoti to Robert to Anastasia in that order. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's a tough one. There are all sorts of answers, but I think for me, the thing that is really important is how do we see humanity? So everybody has a certain worldview, which comes with a view of what a human being is. And I would like to see the narrative rediscovered that human beings are not just consumers, they're not just people who can carry infection and destroy the planet, but we have two hands. We have one mouth as an individual, we have two hands, we have two ears. So I would like to further that conversation that every consumer should be able to be more productive than what he or she consumes because we are creative. And I think we should focus more. It's sort of like the leverage effect where you can try and do all sorts of symptom control and damage control, or you can try and elevate what makes us human, and that's the creativity, the cooperation, that sort of a thing. So that's the narrative that I would love to see developed further.
Thank you, Josie. Robert.
I would say in the midst of COVID right now, one of the things we suffered is the loss of sharing stories. And I'm aware of how often stories get shared at the beginning of a meeting, at the end, at the water cooler. It is often an almost incidental, accidental part of the discussion that winds up being very meaningful. Simon Sinek talks about often the most important thing that goes on in a meeting is in that kind of uncomfortable pause before it starts and after it's over. So my hope would be that as we eventually come out the other side of this, that rather than us having atrophied in the ability to share stories, that there's a pent-up demand and opportunity to reconnect with things like, tell us the story of COVID for you, that we somehow ask each other in an intentional way, what's your story? What's going on with you in a story type form that helps us reconnect? Because I fear now that we can do so much electronically that is not person to person, that we either will see the deprivation of what we've lost and seek to go after it, or we will atrophy and the loss of story will be one key element of our loss of relationship. So my hope is that we come out of this saying, I'm going to be more intentional in sharing my story and asking others about their story.
Thank you. And Anastasia, we're going to give you the last word on this one. And then after that, I'm going to hand back to Prabhu Guptara. Thank you, Anastasia.
Thank you so much, Maureen. Isn't it beautiful that the word COVID only came up on the minute 49 of this conversation? I think it's one of a kind really lately, and that's really beautiful. On COVID, I think actually what we have gotten right this time, I mean, many things were quite wrong, but one thing in terms of storytelling that we really got right is that people used stories to communicate urgent health and hygiene information in the public space, and oftentimes at work. The success of the iconic flatten the curve chart illustrates the power of data-driven storytelling, so that's another good one. You may have seen a video of a father who is being asked by his young child, oh, can you tell me that COVID story again? And then he opens the book of fairy tales and he reads a poem about how back in the day we experienced this, and you're like, oh, can you please read it yet again? So that's another good one. And so I think we kind of leverage communication quite well around these matters. But I think the most powerful story that we could still try to tell each other and across cultures is how humans were helping each other out in this difficult time. I think this was not highlighted enough. Of course, there were measures taken by governments, and of course, there were some kind of collaboration going on in the world, but most collaboration was going on the level of human to human. People collected money for people in other countries, people donated their belongings, people coordinated through the apps that they created themselves to help older people in the community. So all of those beautiful stories we keep hearing, but we don't have the story bank for them just yet. And maybe that's something that we can be preoccupied with now that this is unfortunately going on. And overall, a story of collaboration and a story of how one soul could touch another in various ways would be something that we can do more of in this uneasy time. And of course, a book like Jyoti's would help us by equipping us with the very concrete tools for doing so. So thank you very much again, Jyoti, for this book. And thank you everybody for being a part of this conversation.
Jyoti, I think you've heard some good answers around this, and lots of people are interested in questions about it as well. More questions to come. But we've gone from hype to hack. And on that note, I want to hand over to Prabhu.
There we go. It takes a moment to unmute yourself on this system, so I'm sorry. It remains for me to thank Maureen, Edmondson, Anastasia, Kalinina, Robert Hall, and of course Jyoti Guptara for participating in this discussion and this web launch. I think there are loads of stories out there of businesses doing good, and businesses doing good with each other and to each other and for each other, and businesses actually doing good for consumers. But we don't have a collection of those kinds of stories yet. So maybe, Jyoti, that would be another book to aim at. Business stories from the COVID era or something like that. So anyway, thank you very much for this very lively and interesting discussion. And I want to thank everybody who's asked questions as well. John Oakes, Judy Artish-Carr, Randall Livingston, NIEA, RevRad, and others. I'm sorry if your questions have not been answered, but we're always happy to respond to questions. So do shoot them across to me or to Jyoti or to the website of Pippa Rann Books, and we will very happily try and answer your questions. Thanks also to Roy Child, the IT director of Pippa Rann Books, to Kulli Dhadda, whose Flame Public Relations in London has helped us with this launch, to Anna Lindsay, who's been in the background working away on audience relations, filtering out the questions that have been sent to Maureen for her to pick up and discuss with the panelists. John Oakes of Quercus Public Relations in Cambridge, who helps us with press liaison. Finn Schwartz and Tamo Gulke, who are both involved with the technology and the backstage that enables all this to actually take place. And Rua Technology and Solutions from Australia for all their support in business growth for us. So thank you to all of them, and thank you for participating, those who participated in the program as well. Thank you very much. Have a good evening and a good rest of the day, and many happy business story collecting and retailing experiences in the days to come. Thank you. Goodbye.